Hello, everyone. My name is Gerald Butters. I am a professor of history at Aurora University. I also teach in the graduate program at Northwestern University in their Masters of Liberal Studies program. I'm the author of 4 books, including Beyond Blaxploitation, From Sweetback to Superfly, Banned in Kansas, and Black Manhood on the Silent Screen. And I'm under contract for 2 more books right now. We're finishing a book on director-screenwriter Kevin Wilmot, and also a book on motion picture censorship in the city of Chicago. I'm here today to talk about the role and the portrayal and the importance of Black women in the silent films of Oscar Micheaux. Oscar Micheaux is often considered to be the godfather of Black independent film. He may not have been the first Black director-producer in the United States, but in the first half of the 20th century, he was certainly the most influential. Micheaux is the preeminent figure in African-American silent cinema. He was the most prolific Black filmmaker of the silent era, directing at least 28 silent features or re-edited versions of films between 1919 and 1929. He remained in the industry longer than any other African-American filmmaker, producing and directing films until 1948. Micheaux is seminal to African-American silent cinema because of the dramatically complex ways in which he tackled subjects sensitive to both white Americans and African Americans. Most African-American directors of the silent era were afraid to deal with controversial issues, particularly those involving racism or discrimination. But Micheaux addressed lynching, job discrimination, interracial prejudice, rape, and religious hypocrisy. As Pearl Bowser and Louise Spence have argued, he consistently chose themes that were explosive at the time. I've argued in my previous work that a defense of Black manhood is one of the principal tropes in Oscar Micheaux's films, but equally important were his well-rounded portrayals of Black womanhood. Black women were everywhere in Micheaux's body of silent films, and he often addressed problems that Black women faced in contemporary American society, which made him a unique filmmaker. In the late 20th century, Spike Lee portrayed his beloved Brooklyn on screen, and John Singleton mined his experiences in South Central Los Angeles. Oscar Micheaux consistently mined the biography of his life for stories, personalities, and issues in his films. This included relationships with the women in his life, who are often seminal in his stories. Because Micheaux's own personal life was such an important source of material for both his novels and films, it's important for us to examine his early life. Oscar Micheaux was born in 1884 near Metropolis, Illinois, a farming community in the southern part of the state. His father, Calvin, and his mother, Belle, eventually had a family of 11 children. As Patrick McGilligan has written, his mother was profoundly important to his life. Belle was the disciplinarian of the family and had a profound impact on Micheaux's educational development, even though her own formal education was limited. One of Belle's heroes was Booker T. Washington, and she would pass her admiration of the Tuskegee founder down to her son, Oscar. Belle was a deeply religious woman and a devout member of the AME Church. Micheaux profoundly loved his mother, but his distrust and suspicion of ministers and church elders would develop early in his childhood. A minister who was flirting with his favorite teacher upbraided him when he was a child, and Micheaux never forgave him. J. Ronald Green has written, he resented Black ministers because they often monopolized his mother's and other women's attention and usually got more than their fair share of food on Sunday dinners. By his teenage years, he was also questions the teachings and morality of some of these ministers and was deemed a free thinker and a dangerous associate for other young Christians. The triangular relationship between Micheaux, the women in his life, and Black ministers and elders would reoccur again and again in his literature and films, and this trope was important in his consideration of women, both culturally and socially. Much of what we know about Micheaux's early life comes from his autobiographical novels. The first 3 of these novels, The Conquest, The Forged Note, and The Homesteader, cover the first 35 years of his life. Around the turn of the century, Micheaux left Metropolis and moved to Chicago, then a teeming Black metropolis. This was his home during his late teenage years when he worked as a Pullman porter. The city of Chicago would be an important location for many of his later works, and one in which he would have a love-hate relationship. After eventually being dismissed as a porter, Michaud decided that the romance of the West was his eventual destination. In the fall of 1904, the Rosebud Indian Reservation in South Dakota was to be opened up to lottery by homesteaders. Michaud had saved the incredible sum of $2,343 while working on the railroad and decided to test his fate out west. Michaud's second novel, The Forged Note, covers this transition, and this was apparently a happy time in his life. He encountered relatively little racial prejudice in South Dakota and was fairly successful as a homesteading farmer, at least in the beginning of his adventures in the West. What was far more significant in understanding Michaud's relationship with women, though, was his experiences with love and marriage while on the frontier. The difficult romantic encounters that the would-be author and filmmaker would experience in South Dakota would be a font that he would mine again and again in his novels and films, and would be an important reoccurring trope in his cultural products. He eventually settled near Gregory, South Dakota, and for the first 4 years of his life, this time there, he lived as a bachelor. He worked hard and eventually accumulated around $20,000 in assets, at least according to him, an enormous sum of money for that period of time. But life on the Western frontier could be extremely lonely, particularly for a young Black man in the prime of his life who was isolated from his family and his community. Life could be difficult, particularly during the winters, and Michaud desired somebody to share his life with, the one true woman. She would be a staple figure throughout his novels and films. According to The Conquest, a Scottish family moved close to his homestead in Gregory in 1908. The family were friendly and sociable with Michaud, and he hired out one of the sons to help him on the farm. The family consisted of 2 daughters, 2 sons, and a widower. Michaud soon found himself enormously attracted to the older daughter, who he described as a beautiful blonde maiden. The young woman was not as educated as Michaud, and he tutored the intellectually curious young woman. As J. Ronald Green wrote, their mutual respect and need, their loneliness and isolated proximity led to attraction, affection, and probably mature love. Now, historians have questioned whether this relationship ever existed in real life, or if it was the novelist's adoration of the one true woman who would serve as his ideal in his creative output, whether the relationship really occurred at all. Whatever the situation, it had an important impact on Michaud's oeuvre, because the threat of an interracial romance would be a motif he would return to again and again. The potential romance was doomed from the beginning, since interracial marriage was expressly illegal in many states in the United States, and the South Dakota legislature was considering such a measure as it was supposedly occurring, eventually passing the legislation in 1909. Michaud knew the romance was doomed, and it ended almost after it began. Michaud remained thrifty and industrious and was able to purchase adjoining land, creating an even more successful homestead. He hoped to sell his land for a profit as railroads continued to expand westward. He was supposedly respected and well-liked by his white neighbors, but he was apparently lonely for his own Black community. A race man from a young age, he was convinced that other African Americans should follow his example, and he made several trips back to Chicago, unsuccessfully trying to persuade family members and friends to join him in South Dakota. In 1910, he married Orlee McCracken, the daughter of well-to-do Chicago minister. As Pearl Bowser and Louis Spence claim, the marriage had more to do with Michaud's legal ability to obtain more land under the lottery system as part of the Homestead Act, and less to do with any semblance of love and marriage. The marriage was doomed almost from the beginning. The death of a child, Orlean's loneliness in the homestead, and economic problems led to a permanent separation. The West often meant unknown dangers, isolation, and loneliness for African American women. While the West also offered the promise of opportunity, for a young woman who'd been raised in an urban African American environment, Gregory, South Dakota must have come as a shock. Orlean's minister father eventually brought her back to Chicago. Thus, Michaud lost not only a wife, but also additional homestead. In 1913, Michaud wrote and published his first novel, The Conquest. Michaud was literally a self-taught writer. Henry T. Sampson argues that he began writing as a form of therapy. His homesteading venture had transformed into a financial disaster, and his marriage was a failure. With the publication of his first book, he immediately switched careers, believing he could earn money as a novelist. The popularity of his third novel, The Homesteader, eventually drew the attention of George P. Johnson, booking manager of the Lincoln Motion Picture Company, one of the leading Black producers of film in the country in the 19-teens. The Lincoln Company expressed interest in filming the novel, and Michaud traveled to Omaha, Nebraska, where they were based for discussion of this endeavor. The contract was negotiated and drawn up, but at the last moment, Michaud insisted that he should supervise the motion picture production in Los Angeles. He wanted to expand the format from their standard 3-reel Lincoln production to a 6-reel feature. This was not acceptable to the Lincoln Company or financially possible, so the project fell through. Michaud's topics that he eventually explored cinematically were certainly not conducive to the relatively safe dramas of racial uplift that the Lincoln Motion Picture Company specialized in. Interracial romance, one of the themes of The Homesteader and Michaud's own life, was not a topic that the Johnson brothers included in their own features. This desire to have his novel made into a motion picture on his own terms led to the formation of the Michaud Film and Book Company. Michaud was dramatically impacted by his experiences in South Dakota. He believed that the trek of African Americans northward to cities like Chicago was unnecessary. Instead, he believed African Americans should buy property and work hard to succeed, following the precepts of his mother's hero, Booker T. Washington. As Michaud was negotiating the rights to the homesteader, the Great Migration was in full swing. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans were escaping Southern poverty, limited economic opportunity, and the system of Jim Crow by moving north. Throughout his novels and films, Michaud offered an alternative, the West. In his novel, The Homesteader, he claimed, "There's something about a new country, the West, and her hopefulness that's contagious. Here in this new land come the best from everywhere. With them, there's no Negro problem in their world, too busy to bother with us." Perhaps a masculinist statement, he believed that the West offered African American men and women new opportunities and the possibility of escaping race and prejudice. The Homesteader was a Western. Michaud's first film was highly autobiographical, drawing from supposed pivotal incidents in his life. Pearl Bowser and Louise Spence argue that Michaud created his own biographical legend, so it's difficult to figure out what's true and what isn't. A reworking of his third novel, Michaud's heroic male figure in the novel and the film was Jean-Baptiste. The name is symbolic. It draws upon the legacy of Jean-Baptiste Pontellier, a Black French frontiersman and the founder of Chicago, Michaud's adopted home. It also draws on John the Baptist, the saintly yet tortured follower of Christ. The Homesteader is a highly objectified viewing of the events of Michaud's life, and he uses the hero as a soapbox in which he espouses many of his racial, gender, and political beliefs. An extant copy of The Homesteader no longer exists, but I've been able to construct an outline of it based on the novel and film reviews of the period. Michaud's production was unique in several respects. Released in 1919, The Homesteader was one of the first films to use established Black stage talent. Charles Lucas, Evelyn Preer, and Iris Hall, the stars of the film, were respected actors who were members of the Lafayette Players Dramatic Stock Company of New York City. The Lafayette Players regularly went on tour, so Michaud was presenting actors and actresses with which the African-American urban community was already familiar. Michaud helped create a star system for Black actresses as a result of him casting the Lafayette Players. Evelyn Preer in particular saw her popularity as an actress climb substantially as Michaud cast her in numerous films in the 1920s. She regularly made personal appearances at theaters that exhibited her films and helped out with the publicity. So she's argued to be the first Black actress to be a film star in the African-American community. She played many different types of roles in Michaud's films, illustrating her versatility. The Homesteader is significant in Black film history for numerous reasons. It was the first feature-length Black film directed. In his promotional advertising, Michaud argued the film was different. Released 4 years after the infamous The Birth of a Nation, The Homesteader was, quote, destined to mark a new epoch in the achievements of the darker race. Michaud proudly presented African Americans as the leading characters in the film. He claimed, the Black man and woman have had almost no opportunity to display their skills or qualities. Every race man and woman should cast aside their skepticism regarding the Negro's ability as a motion picture star and go and see, not only for the absorbing interest obtained within, but as an appreciation of those finer arts, which no race can ignore, and hope to obtain a higher plane of thought and action. Michaud was simply giving African-American women the opportunity to use their talents and shine in his films. While Hollywood had not yet solidified a litany of Black cinematic stereotypes, vaudevillian stereotypes abounded in silent films, and Black women suffered. Michaud was determined to allow Black women to fully display their talents. He continued, another feature to the advantage of The Homesteader is that aside from the general public, whom themselves, having never seen a picture in which the Negro race and Negro hero is so portrayed, and therefore be expected to appreciate the photoplay as a diversion, 12 million Negro people will have their first opportunity to see their race in stellar roles. Michaud was clearly producing and directing a film that would counter racist depictions in the mainstream motion picture industry, but he was also developing films specifically for the Black community. While other Black-owned motion picture companies were attempting similar projects of redeveloping Black imagery on the screen, Michaud proudly and boldly proclaimed his ambitions in his advertising material. In the cinematic version of Michaud's life, Jean-Baptiste purchases land in South Dakota. From the beginning of the story, the moviegoers persuaded to identify with the character. He's described as young. The homesteader is past 22, vigorous, strong, healthy, and courageous. Charles Lucas, as the homesteader, was a very light-skinned leading man with good hair and a strong physique. In a promotional photo, he's depicted strongly upright and determined, with one of his co-stars feeling his manly bicep. In both the novel and the film, the homesteader is depicted as a solitary figure. He's far off from the Dakotas, away from the trappings of civilization. Now, Jean-Baptiste is alone, not only from African Americans, but for hundreds of miles from almost nearly everyone. But Jean-Baptiste does not plan on spending the rest of his life by himself. He has a great hope to find a great love, his dream girl. Jean-Baptiste regularly dreams about his future love. At this point in the novel and film, Jack Stewart, a Scotchman, and his daughter Agnes wander into the Dakotas, supposedly replicating the events of Michaud's real life. Agnes is described as beautiful and a captivating woman who not only sweeps Jean-Baptiste off his feet, but saves his life twice. They're desperately in love with one another. A reviewer of the Chicago Defender described the relationship as the most appealing and idealistic ever created. But the couple could never be married or consummate their love because Agnes was white and Jean-Baptiste Black. Michaud explained that according to the custom of the country and its laws, she could never be anything to him. If marriage did take place, he argued, it would create a chasm so deep socially that bridging it was impossible. The film and novel go to great length to explain the racial and social disaster that such a marriage might bring. As Pearl Bowser and Louis Spence have argued, for Michaud, the problem of miscegenation is not the mixing of the races, but the denial of racial identity and disloyalty that comes from trying to hide one's own race. Thus, passing was an underlying premise. Now, Agnes is portrayed by actress Iris Hall. A narratological trick is played by Michaud in casting her. According to the storyline, she's a white woman in the West. But many in the audience may have known that Hall was a Black actress. Comparable to Nella Larsen's passing, one questions whether the characters in the film and the audience knew of her true identity. But it would have been socially impossible for Michaud to have cast a white actress in this role in 1919. The most telling racial observations and commentary in The Homesteader are the lovers' reaction to their predicament. Agnes questions, I've often wondered so often since meeting him how it feels to be a Negro. As immigrants to this country, Agnes and her father attempt to understand the geographic distinctions in racism and segregation. Agnes, a Black actress playing a white Western woman, is Michaud's mouthpiece in his first film. Agnes explains, I understand there's a sort of prejudice against the race in this country, that in the South they're held down and badly treated, that in the North even they're not treated fairly. Michaud's problematic in this section of the film. Reiterating the worst racist thoughts of many Americans, he then, through Agnes, clearly points out that Jean-Baptiste is different. She insists, take that Jean-Baptiste, for example, an educated man and what a gentleman. In a slap at white racial bigotry, Agnes explains, but Papa, he says that only half the colored people in this country are full blood, that in the days of slavery and since, the white man who is often very ready to abuse the Black man has been the cause of this mixture. I should think that their consciousness would disturb them. As Bowser and Spence have claimed, Michaud envisioned himself as an instructive voice and an empowering interpreter of Black life for the community. It's important he chose a Black actress to be his mouthpiece in his first feature. Jean-Baptiste does not propose marriage to Agnes because it would mean both personal disaster and the lack of commitments due to his race. He throws away his one true love because of the racial dictates of the era. As in Michaud's real life, Jean-Baptiste travels to Chicago to obtain an African-American wife. He settles on his third choice, Orlean, played by Evelyn Preer. She's described in the novel as timid and weak-willed. She's actually controlled by Ethel, her sister, and the Reverend N. Justin McCarthy, her father. Michaud's real father-in-law was named McCracken, so McCracken, McCarthy. The real conflict in the story is not between husband and wife, because Jean-Baptiste and Orlean eventually marry, but between son-in-law and father-in-law. As in real life, the couple moved to South Dakota, where Orlean is desperately unhappy. Her loneliness, perpetual interference by her sister and father, and the death of the young couple's child destroys the marriage. While Jean-Baptiste is busy trying to keep the farm afloat, Agnes gives birth and the child dies. This is unforgivable to the Reverend McCarthy. He goes to South Dakota, takes his daughter back to Chicago, and promptly persuades her to divorce him and take her share of the property. Orlean is apparently spineless and unwilling to question her father. But fate intervenes and saves Jean-Baptiste. The death of her child and being ripped away from her husband caused Orlean to go mad. In a rage of fury, she kills her father and commits suicide. So Jean-Baptiste is saved from the possibility of divorce and losing his land. Quite inconveniently, it's discovered that Agnes, his true love, had a mother who was a West Indian. Therefore, being of mixed racial ancestry made marriage to Jean-Baptiste now suddenly socially acceptable. As the Chicago Defender explained, the story is a beautiful ending after a life of storm and misery. Color consciousness in his casting is a question for those writing on Michaud's cinematic work. He created a star system in his body of silent films of largely light-skinned performers. These included actresses Iris Hall, Shingzi Howard, Evelyn Preer, and Carmen Newsom. He chose these actresses for their look and appeal to audiences, but he didn't associate being fair-skinned with supposed inherent qualities. While Agnes, played by light-skinned actress Iris Hall, was the dream girl, Orlean, played by fair-skinned Evelyn Preer, was weak-willed, emotional, and self-destructive, unable to fight the manipulations of her family members. Ethel, played by Ina Smith, is, quote, possessed with all the evil a woman is capable of. Therefore, color did not determine whether one was a positive or negative depiction of Black womanhood in Michaud's oeuvre. Migration, as Orlean did to follow her husband to South Dakota, was a theme in a number of Michaud's silent features. The motivation for African-American women to migrate in the early 20th century were numerous: to escape from racial violence, for economic opportunity, the ability to vote, and to settle with one's family. Michaud reflected what was happening in the Black community in the 19 teens and 1920s. In A Symbol of the Unconquered from 1920, a Black woman moves west. In Deceit from 1921, a couple moves from the small town to the big city. What Michaud was reflecting was the reality of African-American life. Lives were displaced and morals changed as hundreds of thousands of African-Americans participated in the Great Migration. Organizations such as the National Association of Colored Women was founded as a result of these migratory patterns. Michaud specifically saw the West as a place in which Black men and women could realize their own destiny. Race theaters regularly featured Westerns in the 19 teens and throughout the 1920s. As a mythic space of moral drama, Westerns offered unbridled opportunities for Black men and women. Within Our Gates, Michaud's second film was his most scandalous and controversial. Criticized by segments of both the Black and white communities, the film had numerous censorship problems. It was certainly Michaud at his most provocative. But the diversity of portrayals of women in the film is astounding, and he centers the Black female experience in this film to a degree not seen in cinema, and it really would not be seen in cinema for another 70 years. The filmmaker was illustrating racial violence and bigotry on the screen, topics that were featured in almost every issue of the Chicago Defender, the Black newspaper of record in the 19-teens and 1920s. The film was released shortly after a summer of race riots in 1919, and the timeliness of the film in regard to racial sensitivity played into Michaud's problems with this exhibition. The print of Within Our Gates, now available to the viewer, is not the original film that Michaud screened for film audiences in January of 1920. Jane Gaines has argued the video release of the film is perhaps the skeletal remains of Michaud's original intended product. But even the surviving print is remarkably radical in consideration of contemporary cinematic discourse among African-American filmmakers of the era, particularly in his consideration of the lives of African-American women. Jane Gaines explained that the problem with The Birth of a Nation had with censorship was it told a completely fabricated version of American history. Within Our Gates, on the other hand, was critiqued and censored because it told too much truth. From the opening title, Michaud makes it clear that this film will deal with a topic completely avoided by contemporary African-American and white filmmakers: lynching. Mark Reed claims that Michaud himself witnessed the horrible lynching of Leo Frank. Thus, he had personal experience with a horrific crime. Michaud's title card reads, "At the opening of our drama, we find our characters in the North where the prejudice and hatreds of the South do not exist, although this does not prevent the occasional lynching of a Negro." What's he mean by this statement? That racism and prejudice is not as severe as in the North, or is not as severe in the North? Or is he being flippant by arguing the North is just as guilty of these crimes as the South is? The film centers on a heroine, Sylvia Landry, a school teacher from the South, quote, typical of the intelligent Negro of our time. Black teachers in the South were widely respected individuals in the community and often came from one of the first generations of Black women to attend college. The first half of the film centers on Piney Woods, far from all civilizations and in the depths of the forests of the South, where ignorance and the lynch law reigned supreme, where we find the school for Negroes. Thus, Sylvia's act of educating Black children is a daring one, because she's accomplishing this in a climate of hate. Michaud demonstrates that the lack of educational opportunities available to African-American children are there. Sylvia arrives in Piney Woods, supposedly from the North, but rural folk also arrived, described as others who could not read. The founder of the school is Reverend Wilson Jacobs, and he's hired Sylvia. Unfortunately, like many Black schools of the South, it's extremely underfunded, and the private school is just about out of funds. New students have to be turned away every day. Sylvia takes initiative and decides she must raise money for the school. With her bags packed, she explains to Wilson, "It is my duty and the duty of each member of our race to destroy ignorance and superstition." Like many other Black activist women in the early 20th century, Sylvia is a fundraiser and an educator, and she will do what is necessary so that African-American children will get an education. We are then introduced to Sylvia's potential love interest, Dr. Vivian. He's a race man who's devoted to Black education as much as Sylvia is. They meet when he rescues her from a potential thief. Michaud is one of the few Black independent filmmakers to have a multiracial cast. Now, this is a critical subject in race films because, as Jane Gaines argues, one can watch hours of race movies without seeing a white face. I believe it's also important because the juxtaposition of white women and Black women was critical in Michaud's exposition on Black womanhood. His films, therefore, must have been received differently by African-American audiences than all Black race films, which made up the majority of the genre. Michaud was depicting the realities of American life, not a world in which there were no white people. J. Ronald Green claims that although African Americans remain the central actors at every point in the narrative, Michaud includes the full range of white people in his films. Mrs. Geraldine Stratton, a rich Southern woman passing through Boston, is introduced to the viewer. She's the embodiment of Southern prejudice. She opposes female suffrage because she fears Black women will get the right to vote. In a movement dominated by white women, many suffragettes were willing to sacrifice the right for Black sisters to vote so that they could get the votes themselves. It was a divisive issue within the movement, and this was reflected in the famous suffrage march at President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration in 1913, when Black women were literally instructed to march at the back of the procession. Stratton reads a newspaper column, "Law proposed to stop Negroes a vote." It explains that Mississippi Senator James K. Vardaman has proposed a bill to negate the 15th Amendment. His justification is that, quote, "From the soles of their flat feet to the crown of their head, Negroes are undoubtedly inferior beings. Therefore, how can we in conscience permit them to vote?" Black audiences were already aware that the state of Mississippi had effectively disenfranchised Black men through various devious tactics, and now we're doing the same, and we're drawing up plans to never allow Black women to vote either. Vardaman's blatant racial attack guaranteed the unification of the Black audience. Sylvia had difficulty raising funds until she accidentally meets a wealthy white philanthropist, Mrs. Elena Warwick, who literally hits her with her automobile. Sylvia explains the Piney Woods school financial crisis. Mrs. Warwick then approaches Geraldine for advice about the matter, and she espouses a litany of reasons for Mrs. Warwick not to donate money for Black education. This white bigot represents traditional racist arguments that support discrimination and prejudice. Michaud is quite subversive by making Geraldine the point of ridicule, particularly in comparison to Sylvia, who only wants to better her race and her people. In the second half of the film, a second storyline proceeds, a lengthy flashback. This was the way for Michaud to work in the lynching angle. It also became the most action-packed and racially confrontational part of the film. It's revealed that Sylvia is actually the adopted daughter of the Landrys depicted here. Jasper Landry and his wife, she's unnamed in the film, are typical Southern sharecroppers elevated by Michaud. Their eternal hope is a home for their family, a few acres of land, a church to attend, and an education for their children. The importance of education is stressed throughout the film. Many Northern audience members, men and women, were recent migrants, having the same drama as the Landrys. Their stepdaughter Sylvia was now well educated because of their hard work. The Landrys work the land of Philip Grattlestone. He's described as a modern Nero, feared by the Negroes and envied and hated by white farmers. Grattlestone has been stealing from his sharecroppers for years. Their lack of education has allowed him to juggle the books to his financial advantage. Sylvia, defiant, is determined she will no longer allow her parents to be robbed. So she carefully manages their accounts so they can settle with Grattlestone without argument. Jasper enters the back door of Grattlestone house and goes to his office. While in the office, a poor white man comes to the window and shoots the plantation owner. Jasper grabs his head in frustration, realizing the horrible dilemma he is in, along with a dead body, a dead white body. White men began to gather in the city sidewalks to discuss the matter. The Landrys run off to the swamp with the little belongings they can carry, trying to save their lives. They attempt to escape through a terrific rainstorm. Mobs of men and boys set out on foot to capture the family. The manhunt goes on for a week. Jasper Landry, his wife, and son are finally captured. The committee, depicted here, a crazed vigilante group of white citizens, marched the family to their place of execution on Sunday, the Lord's Day. With clubs in their hands, the barbaric mob takes Mrs. Landry and beats her, while one man strips off her dress. Jasper tries to choke the white man who humiliates his wife. This act of violent and sexualized aggression cuts to the bone of the experience of many African-American women, both under slavery and in the Jim Crow South. Black husbands had limited means to protect their wives and daughters. Jasper clearly fought back to protect her. What follows this scene is a superbly chilling and heart-wrenching succession of shots in which Michaud shows the fate of the Landry family. Jane Gaines calls this lynching a sensational spectacle. Rather than as a public spectacle in which African Americans are taught to stay in their place, Michaud depicts the gruesome event in order to cause horror and indignation in his audience. A shot-by-shot analysis is necessary to demonstrate the unsettling artistry that Michaud has used to shock his audience. Shot 1 is a telling scene of a lynching rope literally swinging in the breeze. Shot 2 shows Mrs. Landry grabbing her boy Emile, trying to protect him. Literally shows, this is the most single damning shot of the entire film. It shows the mob placing a noose around 10-year-old Emile's neck. His mother simply cannot save him. Shot 4 shows a noose being placed around Jasper Landry's neck. Shot 5 shows Emile running away as the mob is attending to his father. The men shoot at Emile and he falls, wounded and prostrated on the ground. But shot 6, which you see here, in a relieving moment, demonstrates the boy has faked his death. He runs away and steals a horse while the crowd continues to shoot at him. Shot 7 shows both man and wife with ropes around their neck. Clearly you see here that her dress has been torn off. Shot 8 shows the white men pulling the ropes. The final shot shows these same men placing kindling around the lynching posts. These series of shots remain the most remarkable and disturbing in African-American silent film. They're well edited and graphic, heightening the tension and frustration of the audience. While the majority of the lynching victims in the South were Black men, there were definitely Black women who were also killed by this horrible and nefarious form of violence. White male vigilantism towards African-American women and girls was a means of gendered racial oppression in American society. White men often raped Black women before lynching them. This is signified in the scene in which Mrs. Landry's dress is ripped off. The lynching of Black women was often symbolic. It was a cautionary tale for Black women to maintain their positions of inferiority in Southern society. The Chicago Defender and other Black newspapers regularly gave gruesome accounts of white Southern racial violence. Michaud's film clearly illustrated what African Americans already knew: the brutality and barbaric treatment of innocent Black women and men. Michaud then cross-cutted the flashback sequence, a sophisticated cinematic trick. He alternates the lynching scene with the attempted rape of Sylvia. As Bowser and Spence have succinctly argued, by cross-cutting the defilement of the Black woman and the lynching of the Black male for reasons that have nothing to do with the crimes against white women, Michaud demystifies the pervasive racist myths. What the two fail to remember is, though, that a Black woman was also lynched, Sylvia's adopted mother. Jane Gaines claims that the cross-cutting of these two events demonstrates the connecting roots of race, gender, and sexuality. Now, Sylvia is trapped in a house with Armand Gridlestone, Philip's brother. A title reads, "Still not satisfied with the poor victims in the bonfire, Gridlestone goes looking for Sylvia." Michaud then interweaves scenes of the demise of the Landry family with the molestation of Sylvia, implying that they're happening at the same time. In scene 1, Gridlestone chases Sylvia around the room. In scene 2, the mob cuts down the lynching ropes. In scene 3, Gridlestone rips off Sylvia's coat. In scene 4, the mob starts burning the lynched bodies. In scene 5, Sylvia grabs a knife and frantically fights for her life. In scene 6, a huge burning bonfire in the night consumes the Landry's remains. And in scene 7, Sylvia gives up after a terrific fight. The only thing that saves Sylvia from being raped is Armand Gridlestone's recognition of a scar on Sylvia's chest, identification that this was his mulatto daughter. He never reveals to Sylvia that she's his daughter, but he stops attacking her. Thus, incest, interracial desire, and rape are combined in one explosive scene. Sylvia has agency. She does fight back, but the very act of fighting back might create even more violence for her in the future. Jane Gaines argues that using cross-cutting techniques in the melodramatic form has special meaning for the Black spectator because of the ways the device is used to inscribe power relations. The lynching of the Landry family and the possible rape of Sylvia placed the contemporary African-American spectator in a totally hopeless position, made all too painful because of the recognition that these things happened in the real world. African-American parents were fearful of having their daughter employed in homes with white men. Black women had to learn how to protect themselves from situations where they might be raped. But Gaines argues that this editing technique ultimately empowers the minority spectator by awarding them moral superiority, demonstrating that they recognize the injustice and cruelty evident on the screen. In true melodramatic fashion, there must be a happy ending. Sylvia and Dr. Vivian reunite to spend the rest of their lives together. But the epilogue of the story is one of the most startling changes in political sympathies evident in cinema. The spectator has just witnessed the brutal crimes of lynching and attempted rape. Dr. Vivian, after just reliving the horrible anguish of the Landry family as told by another character in the film, seemed to apologize it all away. He speaks directly to Sylvia, and she is effectively us, the spectator. He says, "Be proud of our country, Sylvia. We should never forget what our people did in Cuba under Roosevelt's command, and in Carrousel in Mexico, and later in France, from Bruges to Chateau-Thierry. We were never immigrants. Be proud of our country always." Now, coming immediately after the American victory in World War I and the wide participation of African Americans in that war, that sentiment might be excused. But he continues. "And you, Sylvia, have been thinking deeply about this, I know. But unfortunately, your thoughts have been warped. In spite of all of your misfortunes, you will always be a patriot and a wife." The film then explains with the title, saying that Sylvia realized Dr. Vivian was right all along. Now, how in the world can any viewer explain this 360-degree turn in political attitudes? How could all of these crimes against Sylvia's family be excused and Sylvia's thoughts are warped? Really? Why was Michaud trying to sweep under the rug the problems he had so clearly laid out for the viewers? Well, Michaud may have added this final scene in the film after censorship problems. The film was initially turned down by the Chicago Board of Censors for its graphic depiction of lynching. Within Our Gates was also a product of its time. Produced during the Red Summer of 1919, the film was a powerful indictment of the immense racial tension that existed in the post-war era. The epilogue may have been a call for peace and an end to violence, of which African Americans were the principal victims. Despite this unusual ending of peace, reconciliation, and patriotism, Michaud did not shy away from controversy in his subsequent films. His 1920 feature, The Symbol of the Unconquered, cemented this. Actress Iris Hall played Eve Mason, the female protagonist of the film. Eve's grandmother dies, and she discovers that she has an inheritance of land out west that he's left her. Eve is a consistently contradictory character in the film. On one hand, she has no problem going out west by herself to claim the land. On the other hand, she frequently cowers in fear and regains her composure only when Hugh Van Allen, played by Walker Thompson, a rural neighbor of Eve's, comes to the rescue. Eve and Hugh are both threatened by an interracial terrorist group, the Knights of the Black Cross, that are simultaneously based on the Ku Klux Klan, yet also quite different because it includes both Indian and African American members. The Knights are used to intimidate Eve and Hugh so that they will eventually leave their land, which is speculated to be worth some real money. Eve often appears weepy and fragile around Hugh, but when she discovers that Hugh's life is in danger from the Klan, she immediately appears in a cowgirl costume, jumps on a horse, and rides magnificently, evading the members of the Knights. Michaud's recurring trope of unknown racial origins reappears in Symbol of the Unconquered. Hugh's in love with Eve, but she's so light-skinned he just assumes she's white and understands any potential romance can be consummated. Eve knows that Hugh is protective of her, but he assumes that she's hesitant because he realizes that she's really Black. This trope is replicated in a subplot in which one of the victims, or one of the villains, I should say, Jefferson Driscoll, played by Michaud's stalwart Lawrence Chenal, is living in the western town of Orristown, and he's passing for white. This ruse works until his mother, here, played by actress Meddy V. Wilkes, appears in the scene as he is romancing a white woman. Mother Driscoll is the epitome of the loving Black woman, but her son is so horrified by her blowing his cover, he screams at her, strangles her until she's down on her knees, and then pushes the rest of her body on the ground. She's rejected, but, quote, the material heart of poor Mother Driscoll is relentlessly drawn to her son, and she refuses to leave the community, instead finding comfort in Eve. Much of the footage of the Symbol of the Unconquered has been lost, but we do find out that oil was found on Hugh Van Allen's land, and he's now a king. Eve returns 2 years later to find Hugh in his office, and she delivers him a letter. It reads, "And we send you Miss Eve Mason, who has rendered a great service to the cause of this Black race, despite her white skin. Miss Eve is born of Black parents. You will be able to give her your contribution without fear." Quote, or signed, the Committee for the Improvement of the Race. So Hugh discovers consequently that Eve, first off, really is Black, and secondly, is a race woman fighting for the betterment of African Americans. She is the ideal woman in Michaud's agenda. As many historians have argued, Michaud worked out his own biography on the screen. The 1924 film Body and Soul was the director's quintessential attempt to get back at his real-life ex-father-in-law and all bootleg preachers who he considered to be immoral or corrupt. This was controversial on Michaud's part, considering the importance of the church in the African-American community. The film focuses on the Right Reverend Isaiah T. Jenkins, a criminal who poses as a man of God. Much has been written about the fact that this was the first cinematic role of Paul Robeson, one of the most influential actors of the early 20th century. But Michaud's depiction of the Reverend's female victims makes for an engrossing and troubling scenario in the culture of the times. There is no doubt that Jenkins is a notoriously corrupt man. He drinks even on the pulpit and blackmails those that he can. After concluding his service, Jenkins is introduced to Isabel, Julia Teresa Russell, who you see here on the right, and her mother, Martha Jane Mercedes Gilbert, portrayed here on the left. Jenkins wants the young woman sexually. Martha, believing that all preachers are men of God, desperately wants her daughter to marry Jenkins. She's symbolic of the Black community's blind loyalty and admiration for ministers. Jenkins' Black pastoral outfit and large brim hat provide him a cover for his immoral activities. Women in the church, such as Sis Celine and Sis Lucy, treat him like a saint, catering to his every whim and indulging in his own sense of esteem. Isabel can see beyond Jenkins' false exterior, though. She's not blinded by his pastoral position. She refuses to be romantically involved or even consider marriage to the man. Desperate, she's forced to flee home since she can't disappoint her mother, and she goes to live in poverty in Atlanta. The crushing emotional pressure by her mother and other women in the community to marry this man are such, she'd rather die in obscurity than be in this man's grasp. Martha eventually finds her sickly child, whom she assumes ran off with her life savings. But Isabel tells her she didn't steal the hardworking woman's money. Jenkins confiscated the money and then raped the poor girl. Isabel eventually dies of starvation, privation, and grief. She's the ultimate victim of this horrible fake minister. Her mother eventually sees the light and confronts Reverend Jenkins in front of his congregation. Her agency makes the rest of the church community turn on the preacher as he runs for his life, chased by bloodhounds. One can only imagine that death is his fate at the end. As Charles Muser has written, the character of Martha Jane is a remarkable, sophisticated study of this woman's pathology, her willful blindness and girlish naivete in the face of a difficult life of toil. As the dreamer, she's the film's psychological center. She's also the character who changes, who awakens. Black women are often at the racial and psychological center of Michelle's body of film, and Body and Soul is such an exhibit. Michelle wrote, "I've always tried to make my photoplays present the truth, to lay down before the race a cross-section of its own life, to view the colored heart from close range." And those hearts were often those of Black women. The Brute from 1920 was powerful social commentary that examined the problem of the brute of the household. The film concerned the precarious economic position of African-American women. Mildred Carson's guardian, Aunt Clara, has, quote, blind ambitions to see her niece do well in the matrimonial field, so she marries her off to Bull McGee, a shrewd gambler and boss of the underworld. McGee's creed, to make a woman love you, knock her down. The Brute was an obvious condemnation of the physical abuse of women. McGee had to die in the end. Michaud's film, The House Behind the Cedars, was based on the novel by Charles M. Chesnutt about a beautiful mulatto woman passing off as white. Much was made of the film's similarity to the real-life Rhinelander case, in which multimillionaire Leonard Kip Rhinelander married Alice Jones, who was passing for white. The theme is also replicated in 30 Years Later from 1928, which asked the question, should a colored woman marry a white man? While passing an interracial romance or quixotic themes in countless Michaud silent features, what often underlies them was the precariously vulnerable economic position of Black women. In The Broken Violin from 1928, Layla Cooper is a young, intelligent, beautiful daughter of a washerwoman who has a natural talent for the violin. Her drunken father comes home one day in a rage, demanding money from her father, and he then smashes the violin over his wife's head, dashing the young girl's dreams. Film scholar David Gerstner has written on the complicated gender politics in Oscar Michaud's body of work. Michaud often filmed ideal notions of Black manhood through the eyes of women. Women's struggle for freedom and independence, whether it was the ability to choose who one wanted to marry, freedom from racial and sexual attack, the desire to support oneself financially, and the ability to migrate. These are all common tropes in his body of work. Gerstner wrote, "There's an important relationship between feminism and African-American race-men politics. One cannot deny that as African-American female spectators watch portrayals of Black women in Oscar Michaud's silent films, they were identifying with challenges and hopeful opportunities that reflected their own lives." Thank you.